Have you ever had a moment when everything suddenly made sense? A single realization that changed the way you saw someone forever? With narcissistic relationships, there is often one invisible line, a red line, that once you recognize it, you can never unsee. It changes how you interpret their words, their apologies, their promises, and even their moments of kindness. Stay with me until the end, because the final insight may be the one that helps you stop questioning yourself and start seeing the relationship for what it truly is. Once you recognize this red line, you may never look at toxic behavior the same way again. One of the clearest signs that you have crossed the narcissistic red line is when you begin questioning your own reality more often than you trust it. In every healthy relationship, people will occasionally remember events differently or see situations from different perspectives. That is a normal part of human interaction. Healthy partners, friends, or family members can disagree while still respecting each other's experiences. They may say, "I remember it differently," or "help me understand how you saw it." The conversation remains rooted in mutual respect. In a narcissistic dynamic, however, something very different often happens. Instead of simply disagreeing with your perspective, the other person repeatedly dismisses, distorts, or denies your reality until you begin wondering whether your own thoughts, feelings, and memories can be trusted at all. At first, these moments may seem small. You remember a conversation one way, but they insist it never happened. They deny saying hurtful things even when you clearly remember hearing them. When you express that something upset you, they tell you that you are imagining problems, being too emotional, or overreacting. Over time, these experiences begin to accumulate. Instead of trusting your instincts, you start relying on the narcissistic person's version of reality. You replay conversations repeatedly, searching for evidence that maybe you misunderstood. You apologize for things you are no longer sure you did, and you slowly lose confidence in your own judgment. This is one of the most damaging effects of narcissistic manipulation because it weakens the very foundation of emotional independence, your ability to trust yourself. When you stop believing your own perceptions, it becomes much easier for someone else to define your reality for you. Decisions become more difficult because you constantly seek reassurance. Your confidence declines because every thought is filtered through the fear that you might be wrong. The relationship gradually becomes less about mutual understanding and more about one person's version of reality replacing your own. The turning point begins when you recognize this pattern for what it is. You realize that healthy relationships do not require you to abandon your own experiences in order to preserve someone else's comfort. You begin paying attention to consistent behavior instead of isolated explanations. Instead of immediately assuming that your memory or feelings must be incorrect, you allow yourself to consider that your experience is valid. That simple shift is incredibly powerful. It helps rebuild the trust you once had in yourself and reminds you that your thoughts, emotions, and perceptions deserve respect. The moment you stop questioning your own reality and start honoring it again is often the moment the narcissistic red line becomes impossible to ignore. One of the clearest signs that you have crossed the narcissistic red line is when accountability always seems to become your responsibility, no matter what actually happened. In healthy relationships, both people are capable of recognizing when they have made a mistake. They may not always agree immediately, but they are generally willing to reflect on their behavior, apologize when necessary, and work together to repair the relationship. Accountability is shared because both people understand that no one is perfect. In a narcissistic relationship, however, this balance gradually disappears. Instead of taking responsibility for their actions, the narcissistic person often finds ways to shift the focus back onto you, leaving you carrying the emotional weight of conflicts that were never yours to begin with. At first, this pattern can be difficult to recognize. You bring up something that hurt your feelings, hoping to have an honest conversation. Instead of acknowledging your experience, the conversation quickly changes direction. They remind you of a mistake you made weeks or months ago. They accuse you of being too sensitive, too demanding, or impossible to please. They insist that if you had behaved differently, they would never have reacted the way they did. Before long, the original issue has disappeared, and you find yourself apologizing just to end the argument. What started as an attempt to express your feelings becomes another situation where you are expected to carry the blame. Over time, this pattern can become emotionally exhausting. You begin approaching every disagreement with the assumption that you will eventually be held responsible, regardless of the facts. You rehearse conversations in your mind, searching for the perfect words that might prevent the blame from shifting onto you. You become hyper-aware of your own flaws while the other person's behavior remains largely unquestioned. This constant imbalance slowly erodes your confidence because you begin believing that every problem in the relationship must somehow be your fault. The turning point comes when you stop focusing on isolated apologies and start paying attention to consistent patterns of accountability. You ask yourself an important question. When conflict happens, are we both willing to examine our behavior, or am I always the one expected to change? That question often reveals far more than any single argument ever could. Healthy relationships encourage mutual growth, mutual responsibility, and mutual respect. They do not require one person to continually sacrifice their self-worth in order to protect the other person's ego. The moment you recognize that accountability has become a one-way street is often the moment you begin reclaiming your voice, your confidence, and your understanding that a healthy relationship should never require you to carry burdens that belong to someone else. One of the most revealing narcissistic red lines is the moment you realize that the relationship is built more on control than on genuine connection. At first, this difference can be difficult to recognize because controlling behavior is not always obvious. It rarely begins with direct demands or harsh commands. Instead, it often appears in subtle ways that can easily be mistaken for love, concern, or deep interest. They want to know where you are all the time because they say they care. They question your friendships because they claim they are protecting you. They become upset when you spend time with other people and explain that it is only because they love you so much. In the beginning, these behaviors may even feel flattering. You interpret them as signs that you are deeply valued, not realizing that they are slowly reducing your independence. As time goes on, the pattern becomes clearer. Decisions that once felt simple now require their approval. You begin changing your behavior to avoid upsetting them rather than because you genuinely agree with them. You hesitate before expressing an opinion because you already know it may lead to criticism or conflict. Your clothing, your hobbies, your career choices, your friendships, and even your emotions start revolving around what will keep the relationship stable. Without realizing it, your authentic self slowly begins to disappear, replaced by a version of yourself that exists mainly to prevent arguments and maintain someone else's comfort. Healthy relationships work very differently. They encourage individuality instead of suppressing it. Both people are free to have different opinions, separate friendships, personal goals, and independent identities while still feeling emotionally connected. Love creates safety, not fear. It allows each person to grow rather than forcing one person to become smaller so the other can feel bigger. When someone truly values connection, they want to know who you really are, not who they can shape you into becoming. The turning point comes when you begin asking yourself whether your choices are being guided by love or by fear. Are you making decisions because they reflect your values, or because you are trying to avoid someone else's anger, disappointment, or criticism, that question often reveals the hidden red line that has been there all along. The moment you recognize that control has quietly replaced connection, it becomes much harder to ignore the reality of the relationship. You realize that genuine intimacy can never grow where freedom is constantly shrinking. Real love does not require you to surrender your identity in order to keep someone else comfortable. It encourages you to become more fully yourself, not less. That realization becomes the beginning of reclaiming your confidence, your independence, and the parts of yourself that were slowly hidden beneath the weight of someone else's need for control. One of the clearest narcissistic red lines is revealed by the way someone responds when you begin setting healthy boundaries. Boundaries are a normal and necessary part of every healthy relationship. They communicate your limits, protect your emotional well-being, and create an environment where both people can feel respected. In healthy relationships, a boundary may not always be welcomed with enthusiasm, but it is generally acknowledged and respected. The other person may ask questions, express disappointment, or need time to adjust, but they do not treat your boundary as a personal attack. In narcissistic relationships, however, boundaries often trigger a very different response because they limit the control or influence the other person has become accustomed to having. At first, your boundaries may be small. You might decide not to answer late-night phone calls, choose to spend time with friends, decline a request that makes you uncomfortable, or calmly say that you are unwilling to continue a conversation filled with insults. Instead of respecting these reasonable limits, the narcissistic person may react with anger, guilt, criticism, or manipulation. They may accuse you of being selfish, cold, dramatic, or ungrateful. They might remind you of everything they have done for you or suggest that your boundaries prove you no longer care about the relationship. Their goal is often not to understand your needs, but to make you feel uncomfortable enough to remove the boundary altogether. Over time, this pattern can make you afraid of protecting yourself. You begin avoiding healthy boundaries because you know they will likely be followed by conflict, emotional withdrawal, or accusations. Instead of asking yourself what feels safe or respectful, you ask what will keep the other person calm. Your emotional well-being slowly becomes less important than preventing their negative reaction. This is one of the strongest indicators that the relationship has become unhealthy because your needs are consistently treated as obstacles rather than valid parts of the relationship. The turning point comes when you realize that another person's reaction does not determine whether your boundary is reasonable. Healthy boundaries do not require permission to exist. They are expressions of self-respect, not acts of rejection. The more consistently you honor your limits, the more clearly you begin seeing the relationship for what it is. A person who truly values you may not always agree with every boundary, but they will recognize your right to have one. Someone who repeatedly punishes, ignores, or manipulates you for protecting your well-being is revealing something important about the relationship. Once you recognize that pattern, the narcissistic red line becomes impossible to overlook. You understand that genuine love grows stronger through mutual respect, while control becomes threatened whenever healthy boundaries appear. That realization is often the first step toward rebuilding your confidence, protecting your peace, and choosing relationships where your voice is not only heard but respected. One of the most significant narcissistic red lines is the emotional exhaustion that becomes a constant part of your daily life. Every relationship has moments of stress, disagreement, and emotional challenges. Healthy relationships are not perfect, and occasional conflict is completely normal. However, there is an important difference between temporary stress and chronic emotional depletion. In a healthy relationship, difficult conversations usually lead to greater understanding, stronger trust, or meaningful solutions. Even after disagreements, there is often a sense of relief because both people are working toward the same goal. In a narcissistic relationship, the opposite often happens. Instead of feeling closer after conflict, you leave interactions feeling more confused, more anxious, and more emotionally drained than before. At first, you may not notice how much the relationship is affecting you. You tell yourself that everyone has difficult days or that the stress will pass once the current problem is solved. But gradually, the emotional weight begins spreading into every area of your life. You wake up already feeling tense because you are wondering what mood the other person will be in. Before sending a text or expressing an opinion, you carefully think through every word to avoid criticism or conflict. Simple conversations begin to feel emotionally risky because you never know what might trigger another argument. Your nervous system remains in a constant state of alertness, always preparing for the next disappointment, accusation, or emotional outburst. This ongoing exhaustion often causes you to lose touch with yourself. Activities that once brought you joy no longer seem enjoyable because your emotional energy is consumed by managing the relationship. You become less patient with friends and family, not because you care about them less, but because you have so little emotional energy left to give. You may struggle to focus at work, lose confidence in your decisions, or find yourself replaying conversations late into the night instead of resting peacefully. Without realizing it, your life begins revolving around surviving emotional chaos instead of experiencing genuine connection and fulfillment. The turning point comes when you stop dismissing your exhaustion as something normal and begin recognizing it as valuable information. Your mind and body are often communicating something important long before you consciously accept it. Constant emotional fatigue is not a sign that you are weak, overly sensitive, or incapable of handling relationships. It is often a signal that you have been carrying a burden that was never meant to be yours alone. Healthy relationships should contribute to your sense of safety more often than they contribute to your anxiety. While no relationship is free from challenges, you should not consistently feel as though you are losing yourself just to keep the peace. The moment you begin honoring your emotional exhaustion instead of ignoring it, you start recognizing the narcissistic red line for what it truly is, a warning that your well-being has been compromised for far too long. One of the most difficult narcissistic red lines to recognize is the cycle of promises without lasting change. In the beginning, every apology may seem sincere. After a painful argument, they tell you they understand your feelings, promise that things will be different, and reassure you that they never wanted to hurt you. In those moments, it is natural to feel hopeful. You remember the caring person you first met, and you want to believe that this difficult period is only temporary. Hope is a powerful emotion, especially when it is connected to someone you deeply love. It encourages you to focus on what the relationship could become rather than what it consistently is. The challenge is that meaningful change is not measured by words. It is measured by consistent behavior over time. In a healthy relationship, an apology is usually followed by reflection, accountability, and a genuine effort to avoid repeating the same mistake. The other person does not simply acknowledge your pain, they actively work to change the behavior that caused it. In a narcissistic relationship, however, apologies often become part of a repeating cycle. There may be tears, heartfelt promises, grand gestures, or brief periods of kindness that make it seem as though everything has changed. For a little while, the relationship feels peaceful again, but eventually the same criticism, manipulation, dishonesty, or emotional neglect returns, leaving you wondering how you ended up back in the same painful situation. This cycle can be incredibly confusing because each new promise renews your hope. You tell yourself that this time feels different or that perhaps they finally understand how much they have hurt you. Instead of evaluating the overall pattern, you become focused on isolated moments of improvement. Months or even years can pass while you continue waiting for the lasting transformation that never fully arrives. During that time, your own needs are often placed on hold because you are constantly giving the relationship another chance. The turning point comes when you stop asking whether the apology sounded sincere and start asking whether the behavior has truly changed. That single question can transform the way you see the relationship. Genuine growth is not demonstrated through occasional moments of kindness or emotional speeches after conflict. It is reflected in consistent actions, personal responsibility, and lasting respect. Once you begin paying attention to patterns instead of promises, the narcissistic red line becomes impossible to ignore. You realize that potential is not the same as reality, and hope is not the same as evidence. Protecting your heart sometimes means accepting that repeated promises without consistent change are not signs of progress. They are signs that the unhealthy cycle is continuing. Recognizing this truth allows you to make decisions based on what repeatedly happens, rather than on what you keep hoping will happen someday. Perhaps the most powerful narcissistic red line is not something you notice in the other person. It is something you notice in yourself. There comes a moment when you realize you are no longer the person you used to be. Before the relationship, you may have been confident, expressive, spontaneous, and comfortable sharing your thoughts. You laughed more easily, made decisions without constantly seeking reassurance, and felt free to be yourself. But somewhere along the way, that version of you slowly began to disappear. The change was so gradual that you hardly noticed it happening. You adapted little by little, believing each compromise would help the relationship improve. Instead, each compromise moved you further away from your authentic self. You may begin speaking less, because every opinion seems to lead to criticism or an argument. You hesitate before making simple decisions, because you have become accustomed to having your judgment questioned. You apologize for things that are not your fault, simply to keep the peace. You stop wearing certain clothes, spending time with certain friends, or pursuing personal goals because it feels easier than dealing with conflict. Without realizing it, you start organizing your entire life around avoiding another person's negative reactions. The relationship no longer feels like a place where you can grow. It feels like a place where you must constantly shrink to fit someone else's expectations. One of the most painful parts of this experience is that you often blame yourself for the changes. You think you have become anxious, overly emotional, or less capable than you once were. In reality, your mind and body may simply be responding to a prolonged environment of uncertainty, criticism, and emotional instability. Living in a state where you are constantly questioning yourself can slowly erode even the strongest sense of confidence. The person you miss has not disappeared. They have simply been buried beneath years of emotional survival. The turning point begins when you honestly ask yourself a simple but life-changing question. Who have I become in this relationship? That question shifts your focus away from trying to change the other person and toward understanding your own experience. You begin recognizing that healthy love should help you become more secure, more confident, and more connected to yourself, not more fearful and uncertain. As you reconnect with your values, your interests, your friendships, and your own inner voice, you slowly begin reclaiming the parts of yourself that were pushed aside. This is the narcissistic red line that can never be unseen, because once you recognize how much of yourself you have sacrificed to maintain the relationship, you can no longer mistake emotional survival for love. Instead, you begin choosing relationships that allow you to grow, speak freely, and feel emotionally safe. That realization becomes the foundation of healing, because the moment you start finding yourself again is the moment you stop accepting anything that requires you to lose yourself in the first place. Recognizing the narcissistic red line is not about becoming suspicious of everyone or assuming every disagreement is emotional abuse. Every relationship experiences conflict, misunderstanding, and imperfection. The difference lies in the pattern. Healthy relationships move toward greater trust, accountability, and mutual respect. Narcissistic relationships often move toward increasing confusion, emotional imbalance, and loss of self. Once you begin recognizing these recurring patterns, you stop blaming yourself for every conflict. You stop waiting for temporary kindness to erase consistent harm. Most importantly, you begin trusting your own experiences again. The greatest transformation doesn't happen because the narcissistic person changes. It happens because you do. You learn to recognize the difference between love and control, between connection and manipulation, between healthy compromise and emotional self-abandonment. In the end, the narcissistic red line isn't simply something you see in another person. It's the moment you realize your peace, your dignity, and your emotional safety are no longer negotiable. And once you truly see that line, you can never unsee it.